the vote is the underpinnings of the democracy. You cannot talk about democracy unless you understand that the vote is what keeps the democracy. If in fact we do not protect the vote, the right to vote, to make sure that every vote is counted, we cannot claim we're the leaders of democracy.
The most dangerous threat to democracy is the mistaken belief that we have one in this country. We are in the early stages of the next generation voting rights movement in this country. I really believe that.
Keep hope alive! Keep hope alive! Those who cannot lead today cannot lead in 2006 or 2008.
All great movements start in the Bay Area. And the whole image of, again, the teach-in movement's coming out, and we really see this as a model for the rest of the country. You seem, in many ways, not to have been caught up in the political socialization that assumes that the son of a CIA director and people close to him who have been overthrowing governments and democracies throughout the third world for long periods of time would never, ever, ever think of using any dirty tactics in the United States.
Before the Civil War till today, there's been this constant battle to control our voting system in ways that we hadn't thought of before. And basically, they're to control the voting system and election results through machinery, through absentee and early voting, and through restrictive registration practices. In the 1930s, most major urban areas in the United States had the lever voting machines. They were actually first introduced in 1892. So we've had machines for over 100 years. They've been part of our election process in a growing way. By the 1960s, around 1964, computerized voting machines in the form of ballot scanners were introduced. Also in 1964, exit polling was introduced at that exact same time. In the 1970s, the touchscreen DREs were introduced and the full-face push-button machines. So today, 99.4% of all Americans have their ballots processed by machines, whether they're voting absentee or using touchscreen machines or ballot scanners. Only 0.6% of Americans actually have their ballots hand-marked and hand-counted. We are really engaged in remote voting. We have literally been divided from our ballot, and the result is that our votes are up for sale.
I strongly believe that fixing the voting system supersedes everything else. That there was possibly widespread vote fraud is an issue that appears, I think, to be too radioactive for the media, as we found, and also for many Americans. Also, we have conventional wisdom to think about if we want to educate others than ourselves. And this is what I hear when I'm talking to people who aren't living and breathing this stuff the way I've been. I hear people say, there's a certain amount of fraud in every election. And, everybody does it, and it's, it's kind of part of the scenery, and there's not much you can do about it. Or they'll say, well, they wouldn't do that, or they couldn't do that. And I think we have to disabuse them of some of their conventional wisdom.
This is nothing but high-tech, 21st century Karl Rove Jim Crow. It is a deliberate tactic to disenfranchise American citizens. And what they want us to do is look the other way.
You've heard a lot of talk about Ohio, and I want to make sure you understand why that is. It is by no means the only state where the official vote total fails to represent the will of the people. However, Ohio alone had enough electoral votes to swing the presidential election. So to prove that Kerry really won Ohio is to prove that Kerry really won the United States.
I was the roving election attorney on election day for 8 inner-city precincts. When I saw people standing in line for hours and missing machines, I said, it looks like something is wrong here. 2 days after the election, I was in a Unitarian Universalist church. I was the token progressive political scientist. There was a Republican there and a liberal and a moderate guy, and people were lamenting, and the Republican was all happy with this, what I call the cyber vote. I said, we need to get to the bottom of this. These numbers don't make any sense. So after the meeting, I was standing around, and a man came up to me, and I was once asked by a documentary filmmaker, who was this guy? I don't know his name, although I do remember he did look a little like Eugene V. Debs. So I like to think it may have been the ghost of Debs. But this guy comes up to me and goes, look, you're an attorney. Why don't you hold public hearings and put people under oath and preserve the evidence? And not only that, why don't we have them in a black inner city church, since most of the people I saw waiting in line for hours were black? But on the November 13th hearing, thinking maybe 50 people might show up, over 500 people crowded into the New Faith Baptist Church. We took 2 extra hours, 6 hours of testimony, 99 sworn statement, over 200 sworn affidavits. And we had another hearing 2 days later, 250 people, standing room only at the county. Then we had hearings in Cincinnati. Then we had hearings in Cleveland. Then we had hearings in Toledo. Then we had hearings in Mahoning County, in Warren. And not only that, and then, of course, Jesse Jackson entered the picture, and so did John Conyers. And really, when nobody else would take us seriously, it was the Reverend Jackson and Representative John Conyers who said, we've been reading your stuff. It does look like there's massive irregularities. So it was only after we did what lawyers call due diligence and had 600 affidavits sworn under oath, the greatest amount of sworn statement probably in the history of Ohio. No one has ever gone out and taken so many sworn affidavits under oath. But what I said on election day that was attacked as conspiracy theorists is now admitted to by the Washington Post and the New York Times.
My job here today is really to explain to you in as much detail as I can in 10 minutes what happened in Ohio. It's complicated because the strategy was to do a lot of different things, sort of here a vote, there a vote, everywhere a vote, vote. It was a clever strategy, particularly because the constitutionally mandated dates for election certification and inauguration limited the time that was available to us and other investigators to uncover the fraud. By January 6th, when Representative Stephanie Tubbs Jones and Senator Barbara Boxer contested the electoral vote from Ohio, our project had analyzed 15 counties representing 62% of Ohio's registered voters. And it was clear, but not yet broadly accepted, that Kerry would have won a fair election in Ohio. The problems break down really into 3 types: voter suppression, failure to count ballots cast, and alteration of vote totals. For every vote that was switched from Kerry to Bush, Bush's reported margin of victory went up by 2 votes, the one stolen from Kerry and the one gifted to Bush. So it's a very effective thing if you can not only fail to count a Kerry vote, but if you can actually take the Kerry vote and count it for Bush, you get double the reward. In Mahoning County, where Youngstown is, our statistical evidence shows that many electronic voting machines were programmed to default votes to Bush. This means that if a voter was unsuccessful in overriding the default setting, or incidentally, if they chose not to vote for president, their vote went to Bush. 20 to 30 machines in that county were malfunctioning in a way, and this has been confirmed by the Board of Elections in Mahoning County, that meant that voters actually saw their votes jump from Kerry to Bush. However, a machine that's correctly programmed to throw votes to a candidate does not indicate to the voter that it's doing so. So those 20 to 30 machines were only the machines that were doing it wrong. A lot of attention nationally has been paid to the issue of electronic voting machines, which I absolutely believe is important. Yet in Ohio, an even bigger problem seems to have been the electronic tabulators that counted the punch card ballots. As it was mentioned before, even those of us who don't vote on electronic machines generally have our votes counted by electronic machines. Tabulator company Triad GSI, which like Diebold and ES&S has strong ties to the Republican Party, operated tabulators all around the state of Ohio. Their technicians had access to the electronic tabulation machines before, during, and after the election, both in person and remote access. And there's significant evidence of tampering with the tabulators in several counties.
50% of the American votes are counted by just 2 corporations in over 37 states. So when my skeptic friends say nothing on this scale, say 3.5 million votes, could have been accomplished without the involvement of an enormous number of people, I do come back and say, well, it was 2 companies and they're owned by brothers, and they wanted the Republicans to win badly, so you've got to keep an open mind on this.
When Karl Rove stole a second presidential election, the major media referred to him as a genius. The man's no genius. He's a criminal. And if Karl Rove did in business as he did in the election, there would be several counts brought against him for violating the federal RICO statutes, Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act. And the days of Karl Rove engineering elections with the help of a select few private companies, they're not just private companies. These companies, if you look at their interlocking directorships, are run by extremely right-wing, fundamentalist Christian individuals. Let me first talk about this outfit, ES&S. It's owned by the McCarthy Group. One of the individuals, one of the former principals of ES&S is a Republican senator from Nebraska, Chuck Hagel, who's now calling for trying to encourage the youth to turn out to vote. Well, what good is that when you're not going to count their votes anyway, Senator Hagel? But one of the biggest bankrollers of ES&S is a family called the Amundsen family. They're out here in California. One of the principal Amundsens is Howard Amundsen. And it's interesting to see who some of Howard's friends are with a group called the Council for National Policy. Pat Robertson, Richard Viguerie, the guy that came up with direct mail for the Republicans, Ralph Reed, Tom DeLay, Jerry Falwell, one of my favorites, Bob Jones, another one, Grover Norquist, who's, of course, a very, very close colleague of Karl Rove, Oliver North, Don Wildman, and last but not least, Carolyn Hunt, who was one of the owners of a company that was the predecessor to ES&S, Business Records of Texas. And then, of course, our favorite company, Diebold. Headed up by Wally Odell, big Bush contributor, close to Ken Blackwell, Secretary of State of Ohio, and one of his principals is Bob Urosevich, whose brother is over at ES&S. It's also interesting, we heard about the global election systems which Diebold purchased. They had a principal with that particular company named Jeffrey Dean. Jeffrey Dean was convicted for criminal activity. God, you'll never guess for what. Fraud and computer tampering.
I feel certain that we've not uncovered all of the dirty tricks. It is absolutely clear that Kerry would have won a fair election in Ohio, that a majority of the duly registered voters who attempted to vote for president attempted to vote for John Kerry. The evidence that the election was stolen is overwhelming, and this is why I can't move on. You'll hear more about this evidence in the next section of the program on exit polling. But if we let the announced results of this election stand in the face of these mountains of evidence that we have, I believe that there's no reason to expect that we will ever again see a fair election in this country. It's very important that as we're working on future elections, we're also demanding accountability for the stolen election that just occurred.
Exit polls are widely held to be reliable. Exit polls are as scientific as anything in the study of complex systems, including human populations. Many people, though, do not fully realize just how accurate surveys and polls, and particularly exit polls, are. They tend to misunderestimate them. The polls conducted for the 2004 presidential election were under the principal direction of Warren Matofsky, who over 35 years has polled voters in nearly 3,000 elections here and abroad. There is no reason a priori to think that he got this wrong this time. And if you do the statistics, we find that the statistical probability of Kerry receiving 48.1% of the vote, the tallied vote, when the estimate from the national sample was 50.8%, is less than 1 in 959,000.
What we saw in 2004 was a very dramatic discrepancy between the exit polls and the vote counts. And if the exit polls were accurate, what we had was not only a comfortable electoral vote victory for Kerry, but also a popular vote victory, national popular vote victory. This is something that is way off the charts as far as the mainstream media is concerned, as far as what most people have heard. But here it is. This is a distribution curve. So if these exit polls were correct, you had a shifting of 6 to 9 million votes nationwide, including Ohio, New Mexico, Iowa, Florida, all those states. So there's a lot going on if the exit polls are correct. So you have three possible explanations for the exit poll discrepancy. One is chance, the inherent statistical limitations of any sample, any attempt to sample. Two is systemic bias in the polls, some sort of bias that's introduced into the polls. And three is an inaccurate vote count.
Okay, so where does that leave us? If we can rule out systematic bias in the exit polls and random error, then something was awry with the vote tallies. That's League of Women Voters' very polite way of shouting vote fraud. So this is how I now think about last November's election, and believe me, I've thought about it a lot. We've heard a great deal about vote suppression, which affected the intended vote. There were equipment malfunctions. I've ruled out exit polls, that's the X through that. So I've come to believe that the recorded vote was corrupted.
Having raised legitimate concerns about the accuracy of the New Mexico election and having fulfilled requirements for requesting the recount, the Greens and Libertarians were met with fierce resistance from the Democratic governor, the Secretary of State, and state courts. I must point out there wasn't a Republican in sight in New Mexico. So this is a nonpartisan question. Power is power.
Why, after 40 years of the Voting Rights Act, are we still facing such a situation of voting suppression, voting fraud, and the tainting of now 2 consecutive presidential elections? Why now is the black vote being targeted for suppression in ways that were seen in the 100 years since the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, those 100 years that passed between 1865 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965? And I think the simple answer to that is the opponents to democracy, the opponents of civil rights, the opponents of black enfranchisement and black empowerment have never given up. They've never given up in ways that the supporters of civil rights have given up. So now what we have a situation is that the poll taxes, the attack dogs, and the fire hoses have been replaced by voting machines, provisional ballot rulings, rulings on felons' right to vote. And we have a situation where state secretaries of states, from Kathleen Harris to Blackwell, can now have a major effect on our federal elections. So we have 13,000 separate and unequal voting systems in America today. So fundamental to electoral reform, fundamental to black empowerment and the new black civil rights and voting rights movement must be a challenge to the states' rights system that still is in place in America. In the 2004 election, and probably every election since I cannot remember, the Democrats have written off the entire South as part of their voting strategy. And when you write off the entire South as part of a voting strategy where at this time some 55% of African Americans still reside, and that percentage is growing over the years, you give credence to the Republican rhetoric that Democrats are taking African Americans for granted. You cannot have a progressive movement, you cannot enact electoral reform, you cannot win elections when you write off the South and give up your base among African American voters.
We need to make our new voter rights movement one that is inclusive. We have to recognize that those who have been the most victimized by this voting system are the African Americans who get the worst machines and the longest lines, are the Native Americans who have been harassed on the reservations, are the new immigrants who have not had compliance with bilingual ballot mandates, and are the young people like in Kenyon College who had to stand 8 hours online, young people who can't get their registration where they are going to school because they are registered somewhere else. We have to incorporate people of color and young people into our movement to make it strong, to make it vibrant.
True, this election was stolen. There's no doubt about that in my mind. The Republicans stole the election and they stole the previous one. But in that having been said, there are things that we can do to ensure that we maximize the vote that we have. What I want us to do very clearly, and this is my one point here today, is to organize in Alameda County and to develop the process, a model for organizing registration and polling place controls throughout the state. And if that becomes something that's effective on a national level, it would make a big difference.
At the citywide level, there is so much we can do. It got hidden in the ruckus of the presidential election, but in this last election in San Francisco, we did do something historic, and that is use instant runoff voting in our election. Let's see that move city to city to city.
There's other things that we need to look beyond in terms of election reform. Same-day registration, which we flirted with in this state, outlawing people like Kurt Pringle, who you may remember from the Assembly. He's now the mayor of Anaheim. This is the guy who hired security guards to stand outside polling places in Orange County to intimidate Latino voters. He spent $400,000 on security guards. Our side can rarely put together 50 grand to run voter registration and mobilization. So we need to outlaw people like Kurt Pringle. And finally, we need to look at public financing, because there's no way that we can compete on this playing field when they can outspend us the way that they did. Now, in local races, in state races, in state senate and congressional races, we get outspent 2 to 1, 3 to 1. Labor gets outspent anywhere from 11 to 17 to 1 by corporations. We will never win on this battlefield without some kind of public financing.
Let us not divide our movement into those who, quote, care about the civil rights issues and those who are focused exclusively on the machines. We must look at them them together. If we can only pass the bills now that deal with the machines and the verified paper ballot, let us give our support to pass those bills. But at the same time, let us use the bills, like the Clinton bill, as a focus for education, as a focus for pressure on our elected officials, because the issues of voter suppression are key issues and we cannot let them go.
I think it's incumbent on us now to help others understand what happened on November 2nd, 2004. When they do, because when people hear this for the first time, they're stunned, they're shocked, they get angry, but most people don't know what we know or what we're learning, still learning. But when they do, when other people know what we know, we'll fix this broken system and we'll move ahead.
So you only need to know really 3 things about this election. 20% of Americans in a Gallup poll right after the election said that they think something bad happened. And if we don't have the trust of the governed in our democracy, we don't have the consent of the governed in our democracy. And that's enough to know that we have a democracy in crisis. When tens of thousands of random glitches overwhelmingly favor a single candidate, that is by definition not random. So you don't have to keep track of all the data on this election. All you have to know is that something very not random has been happening and we need an explanation. So you don't even have to believe this election was stolen. All you have to believe is that we don't trust it. It's riggable, it's not transparent, it's privatized, Americans don't trust it. So try getting over that and get moving.
So what do we have to do? We have to organize and educate, but make sure we've got the simple solution. Let's not keep the corporations in the voting booth. So how do you get from here to there? I would make my legislators' life an unmitigated hell. I would hound them relentlessly. Don't be polite, don't be nice, be at their door and be banging on it constantly. Because if you're nice, nothing's gonna happen. So, we've got the Democrats who are willing victims, we've got the Republicans who are obviously in control. You might want to switch to another party, Libertarian, Green, somebody who does something. But you gotta get angry and you gotta get to work.
Unless we get this right on voting, nothing else matters. These neocon plans to violate the law and use the U.S. military to invade other countries, to plot aggressive war, which is illegal under the UN Charter, which is illegal under the principles of Nuremberg. That's what this is about. And the reality is the facts are on our side. They stole those elections. The exit polls were in fact right. They've now privatized the vote. They are secretly counting the vote with their secret software. And what we're saying is we want full transparency, and we will stand with Lincoln in the battle we won in the Civil War, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. And it begins here today. The new voting rights movement in the United States. All power to the people. Thank you.
The right to vote. We marched too much. We bled too profusely. We died too young for the martyrs, for King and Swanner and Goodman and Channer and Louiso. Surely they smile today. We march holding high the beacon of liberty and hope. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. I love you. God bless you.